Okay. Yeah. So, hi Zoe. I believe you are currently the Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Thompson Reuters Foundation. So, I've heard you run the coverage of technology and digital rights, including privacy, surveillance, and AI. And I think you're giving a talk on surveillance and ethical technology, which is going to be a very interesting talk since the participants will have to integrate the ethical side of things into their projects over the next couple of weeks. So I'm sure they'll love to hear about the ethical considerations and also about surveillance.
Thanks, Hannah. Before I start, I'd love to know a bit more about the team, kind of who's online, how old people are, what they're currently working on.
Sorry, the team is in.
As in anyone who's listening in now, like who am I speaking to? I'd love to know.
So pretty much a bunch of people from, I think, the age of 12 to 18 who are going to be doing the accelerator over the this week, next week, and the week after. And they're in teams to build their products using AI. And so when they eventually pitch 2 weeks later to judges, that's when they will be thinking about ethics, or rather they'll be thinking about ethics all the way through, but that's when they'll have to showcase how they're going to tackle the ethical issues that might be present.
Okay, thank you. That's really useful. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining and kind of tuning in. I don't want to speak at you for too long. So first of all, please do raise your hand as I chat if you have any questions. And yeah, when I'm done, I'd kind of love to hear, I'm a journalist, so I'm interested in stories, and I would love to hear what you guys are working on, some of the projects you're working on. But to start, as Hannah said, I'm Zoe. I'm currently the Deputy Editor-in-Chief for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and I also run our tech coverage. Now, for those of you who don't know us, we're the charitable arm of Thomson Reuters, which you may be more familiar with. And while they cover mostly business and financial and political news, we look at more underreported stories like human rights. So ranging from women's rights to LGBT rights, climate change, and more recently, technology. That's included, as Hannah said, a whole range of issues. Surveillance, of course, which I know you guys are interested in. So, how it can be used for efficiency and safety, for example, in tracking the spread of COVID, but also the other side of the coin and how it can impinge on privacy, or in some cases be used to discriminate against marginalized communities. We also look at what, this may be a term you've heard of before, what we call the digital divide. So the kind of growing gap between those who have access to technology and those who lack it, be that in education, in work, access to health. But we're also interested in any efforts to bridge that gap. For example, donating unwanted computers or rolling out kind of broadband in impoverished areas. We're also really interested in smart cities, which is also relevant to kind of AI, of course. So looking at kind of efforts to create greener, cheaper, and more efficient cities around the world, aided by tech sensors, among other things. And so as part of that, we look at how well they've kind of fared so far, but also any concerns around kind of privacy and collecting residents' data. Another issue we've been covering is AI and discrimination. So, looking at how AI has created a wave of opportunities from tackling diseases to improving transport, but in some case, how it can also increase inequality or discriminate against certain groups. So I'm thinking people of color, women, for example, in access to housing or finance or kind of hiring practices even. So as part of that, that's of course very closely related also to data and privacy. So we're interested in the debate over who owns your data, whether that's the individual, businesses, regulators, what value we as individuals place on it, and ways in which it's sometimes misused. For example, period apps for women that store sometimes excessive information, or social data, your media data that can be used to block your or refuse your access to credit. So a range of applications of that. Quite interested as well in digital identity and biometrics. So lots of countries around the world have kind of plans or have already rolled out digital ID systems that want to make it easier for people around the world to kind of access public services. But again, some kind of concerns around privacy and also who might have access to it. A growing, I think, issue in the tech space, of course, is technology and gig workers. So both looking at how technology is enabling the explosion of gig work. Gig work that might be your Uber driver, it might be a food delivery driver, it might be someone who's come to mow your lawn. So quite a kind of growing sector. So how tech is enabling the boost in that sector, but also any concerns around exploitation of workers and sometimes lack of transparency around how their data is being used by platforms. Quite interested also in technology and in the future of work, which I'm sure is an issue you guys are working on. So, looking at how technology might shape the workplace, facilitate the return to work post-COVID. For example, take the NHS app, kind of tracking any interaction with potentially infected individuals. But also looking at the impact of tech trends on workers who may be already struggling to make an income. So I'm thinking of the automation of work, or we've also reported a fair bit on surveillance of workers, especially during remote working. And I'll go on to this in a bit. Increasingly, not just we and other media kind of look at tech so-called solutions, which I know also aligns closely with what you guys do. So, looking at how technology is being used to improve people's lives, boost human rights. I'm thinking, technology to boost energy efficiency, or virtual currencies that create new sources of income, or even virtual reality to kind of recreate a digital cultural heritage for refugees who may be, cut off from their homes. And then more recently, we've also started looking at issues like internet shutdowns, which there have been a number of over the past years. So looking at how they impact communities and their access to daily services. Really interested in the past year as well in misinformation and its impact on, again, marginalized communities. So I'm thinking, well, you've all heard of the pandemic, of course, and kind of vaccines. We've reported a lot on vaccine hesitancy among certain groups. So how a number of indigenous people in the Amazon, for example, are kind of quite skeptic around vaccines and how people are tackling that. But also any community-led efforts to kind of tackle that and misinformation. Apologies for the sound, I think I'm on. Yeah, it sounds like a plane. And then finally interested in kind of content moderation. So, anything to do with the impact of hate group or hate speech or censorship on specific groups. I'm thinking women or LGBT communities. But also in things like the Facebook Oversight Board, which you guys may have heard of, and who basically kind of decides what content falls foul of certain rules, whether that's automated, who kind of holds that power. And I mean, I'm sure a bunch of these issues are, you guys have heard of a bunch of these issues, but we're certainly not at TRF the only ones working in this space. If you are interested in any of these, I'd strongly recommend following the work, whether that's on Twitter or subscribing to newsletters or just kind of buying it at your newsstand, following the work of Wired, NBC Technology, the Washington Post Tech Team. You have a fantastic newsletter called the MIT Download, which comes out every day that's free. The New York Times Tech newsletter is fantastic. And then a kind of publication I've been kind of discovering more recently, but I think is absolutely brilliant in the tech space, is Rest of World. So who look at kind of tech stories, but mostly from a global South perspective, which I think is very often missing in this sector. And now, before I kind of open up to questions, I just wanted to tell you, I've been asked to talk about surveillance and ethics specifically. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about two recent stories we did and how we went about them. There was one story, an exclusive, in fact, we did a few months ago this year, where our reporter Avi, who's based in California, he used what's known as FOI requests, so freedom of information requests, where you basically write to a certain government and say, I request access to this type of information. I want it to be presented in this way, and I want you to give me the data going back to X number of years. And the government has an obligation to let you know whether they have that data, and if they do, to share it with you. So Avi basically used a bunch of FOI requests to councils all across the UK, including London. And what he found was that at least half of London's councils have bought and rolled out surveillance systems that were made by China and that are linked or were linked to the abuse of Uyghurs and Xinjiang province. And that have kind of raised alarm among human rights and privacy advocates and kind of lawmakers. So surveillance, which, as you guys will know, is nothing new. And of course, it's grown in use during the pandemic. So, doing a range of things from tackling crime to kind of monitoring traffic, again, tracking whether you may have been in contact with an infected individual. But what was interesting here was that taxpayer money, so, your money, your parents' money, was used to buy surveillance made by two companies called Hikvision, which is the world's largest supplier of video surveillance systems, and crucially, which is a vendor to Xinjiang police agencies, and by Dahua Technology, which is China's second largest surveillance equipment maker. And both of them are alleged to have designed Uyghur detection systems, so facial recognition tools that can essentially alert authorities to people's whereabouts. And I think there's an estimated 1 million Uyghurs who are alleged to have been detained in kind of camps in Xinjiang province. So one of the kind of biggest in scale and most egregious, human rights abuses of modern times. So kind of how did we hear about this story and how did Avi go about it? So Avi, and this is where, whether you work in journalism or AI or any other field, I would strongly encourage you to just nurture contacts, even if you might not see an immediate payoff or it might not be immediately clear to you what the benefit will be. But Avi had been in touch with a researcher, so not a journalist, from this firm called Top 10 VPN, and who had access to FOIs to councils. So he shared them with Avi because he had the research, but he then wanted the story to kind of go out. So we did our own reporting. And so the difficulty with that, of course, is that FOI request. Well, first of all, you want to give an idea of the scale. So, there's not one council in London, there are dozens. And in the UK, there are hundreds. So we had, I think it was nearly 100 FOI requests. And each one of those, when you do get the response from the council, it's 3-4 pages long. So you have to go through it. You have to see what they've responded, whether their response makes sense. And you basically have to verify the information you've been given. So that took a fair bit of time. And then, what was the impact? Well, what was fantastic was that we heard that staff for John Tugendhat, who's an MP and also the head of Britain's Foreign Affairs Committee, he said that they were reviewing our story and the research from SAM to inform future work on Chinese human rights policy. And our reporter also discussed the story on BBC World Service. And the follow-up we did to that was that, this was about London, but our reporter, Avi, is based in California. I'm based in London. I worked with one of our producers, Cormac, and I cycled over to one of the councils mentioned in our story, Hammersmith in Fulham, where I used to live. And thanks to a map that I had found from the council, which basically listed all of the public cameras, I managed to find 4 of the Hikvision cameras. So I headed over there and we did a piece to camera just explaining the surveillance context, the company's links to Uyghurs and how we went about finding them. So that was just kind of one example of surveillance. And the second one I wanted to talk to you about, and again, is probably a company you have heard about, is Amazon. Amazon, you may know, I think it was February, announced that they would be rolling out AI-powered cameras in their fleet of about 30,000 delivery vans across the US. Now, the cameras were kind of billed as, improving the safety of both drivers and also the communities in which they operate. But a bunch of employees and delivery drivers from Amazon said to our reporter that they view the cameras as an invasion of privacy and as a way to control them on what's an already really demanding and high pressure job. So how did we find out about the story here? Well, a brilliant reporter who's called Mark DiStefano, who covers Amazon for The Information, he broke the news of the cameras being rolled out because he got an internal email from the company that was leaked to him. Now, I'm sure Amazon would have wanted to handle the announcement differently. It kind of took them by surprise. And so a bunch of media, including Reuters, then followed straight on the news story. Now, our reporter had been, again, the importance of nurturing contacts. He had been cultivating contacts among delivery drivers for a while, as he's generally interested in the gig economy and workers' rights. And so he just went to a bunch of them to kind of show the human angle, like give a human voice to the story. And what he found out was that a bunch of them worried that Amazon might sell or share the footage with third parties or use the cameras to monitor their performance on the job. So, they were saying, well, the footage could be shared with a future possible employer who could then decide to reject you without even knowing you. And so this driver in particular, said that although he does enjoy doing deliveries for Amazon, he's looking for other work because he does not want to be subjected to surveillance. So I think surveillance that is not just for Amazon, but any worker really, and kind of around the world, I think, going to become increasingly a relevant issue. And so the impact of that was that after our story, a union that's called Global Union, they represent more than 20 million workers worldwide. They got in touch with our reporter and they said that they had asked Amazon not to roll out similar cameras in the EU, citing our reporting as evidence. And Amazon then said that they have no plans to bring the cameras to Europe, at least for now. So that's a great example of how, just one story that's done, especially during the pandemic, from your own desk at home, can end up having kind of quite substantial impact. And, a massive company pledging to not roll out a specific product in another area. So in terms of follow-up, what will we do? We're, of course, going to keep close tabs on the rollout of the cameras, see how drivers continue to feel about them, and of course, whether they end up being rolled out elsewhere. Now, those were just a kind of couple of stories I wanted to mention. And of course, which I'm sure is what a lot of you guys are working on, there are absolutely tons of positive stories to be told about AI and kind of ethical AI. We had one, just a month or so ago on how youth activists in the US are taking up the fight for digital rights. So a bunch of high school students we spoke to who have been lobbying governments and kind of congressmen and women directly to try to get them to pass law on AI and related issues. Another one I found personally fascinating is, you guys have probably heard of the wildfires kind of raging across Europe, across the US, of course, across Canada. And AI is being used at the moment in some states to help scarce firefighters. So there's already a shortage of firefighters, to help them identify and predict where future fires might occur so that they can then better target resources. And finally, an issue that I think is fascinating in terms of ethical AI is looking at how it is taking over job hiring. So, supposedly kind of removing any sort of bias by kind of automating the whole process, but looking at whether in some cases and unintentionally, it can end up being sexist or racist, depending on kind of who has designed the technology. So those were, just a few examples. I wanted to stop here and see if you guys had any questions. And in particular, I would love to hear some of what you're all working on.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Zoe, for the talk. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and I'm sure we can read them out, and Zoe would love to get them answered. I actually had a question just to start off. Do you think there are any situations where the benefits of surveillance, say, like if it were near a prison, or if it's just an area where there's particularly high crime, or if the people are already wearing masks due to COVID or something like that, where the benefits of surveillance would outweigh the privacy issues?
That's a really good question. I think it's, that's quite kind of, there basically, in my opinion, is never a case of it was worth it or it wasn't worth it. I think it's a trade-off, and it depends on how you as an individual, but also society, how you value your privacy and your data. There have been a number of cases and stories where we found that AI has indeed helped to kind of tackle crime, or has been really efficient in terms of tracking the spread of COVID. Or I'm thinking even, in terms of kind of violence and violence against a woman. Some of you may remember the tragic case of Sarah Everard a few months ago, a young woman who was kind of abducted and then murdered in London. A number of AI and kind of apps used to improve the safety of women and kind of track where, lets kind of close ones know of women's like whereabouts, and also be able to kind of send help to them as soon as possible, kind of if needed. So I think, yes, AI very often touted as being efficient to tackle crime, facial recognition kind of specifically. And I think, yes, it really depends on how much you value your privacy, but also I think who holds the data and what safeguards are placed on it. Because I think so long as there are very clear limits or conditions as to how your data can be used, I personally, as an individual, see no problems with that. If my data isn't shared with a third party or another government, isn't sold on to anyone else, I'm more than willing to hand over my data to know if I've been pinged and need to self-isolate, if I don't know, track the number of steps I've walked during the day or something like that. However, I think what you often find, and this is the case, well beyond AI, is that very often the people who are most discriminated against in terms of privacy, they're the ones who have the least control or awareness even of their data rights and of privacy. So, I'm thinking of slum dwellers or refugees in refugee camps, or even in some countries of kind of ethnic minorities, where not realizing the value of your data, you may be willing to hand it over much more easily and then have no control over how it's used against you. So basically, yeah, in summary, I think it's a kind of trade-off, and it's all about a balance. And I think it's all about transparency. So just being very clear on how it will be used and making sure that the individual consents to that.
Yeah, thank you. I see we've also got a question in the chat.
What are some ethical concerns that AI facial recognition systems can make? Well, I'd say the most frequent one that comes up, I would say, is probably discrimination again against certain communities. So we did a story just a few weeks ago about Russian companies kind of increasingly rolling out facial recognition systems in Moscow, but also other cities, which these were just allegations, but that kind of human rights groups were said were then being used by the police to, in protest specifically, identify people, either of a certain origin or to be able to identify political opponents and decide, oh, well, I've got their image, I've captured their face, I can arrest them now for, under false pretenses. And again, I think this is where you see the power of reporting, is that story specifically, we looked at facial recognition systems that had race detection features, which I think adds a whole layer of complexity, because there's the idea of capturing your data and what happens with it. That's one thing. And then there's the idea of, well, why would authorities want to know specifically whether you are Black or white or Latin American? Like, why would they kind of want to know your ethnic origin, and what are they going to do with that data? So we published our story and just, we went to the police for comment and to the government, and we also spoke to human rights groups. And what was fantastic was that 2 of the 4 companies we spoke to, and they all sell facial recognition systems, and there is huge value in those, having them at airports or malls, or again, in terms of efficiency. But 2 of the 4 companies, after our story, said that they would stop selling race detection features as part of their products. So they removed that feature entirely, and they said, we don't think the kind of debate or society has advanced enough yet for a safe and fair use to be made of it. We can't really control what's going to happen, so for now, we're just not going to offer it. So that was one example. I think very often in terms of ethical concerns, it'll be discriminating against marginalized communities. Thank you. Any other questions? How can we be more aware of the bias we may create in our code? That's a really good question. I mean, yeah, I would ask you guys, because you guys are the kind of AI experts. I'm just the reporter. I think, even kind of asking the question and questioning your own bias is a great place to start, right? Because I think so often, and this doesn't just apply to technology, but I'm thinking in, I used to write about cities. So you think about urban design, very often the way cities would have been designed would be by white middle-aged men, and very often for men. Or you can tell very often how transport systems are designed by people who don't necessarily have any physical disability. And so you don't kind of have that, a universal kind of consideration in the design of things. So I think kind of questioning it and ensuring basically that your, team of coders or of designers are as representative or diverse as possible, at least for the community that you purport to serve. So that's, I think a big challenge for, and my husband, for example, co-founded a startup, and that's a question they're having to ask themselves, where, all the kind of coders, developers they hire, they're all extremely talented, but they're all men. And so going the kind of extra mile to go, all men and most of them white men as well. So going the extra mile to kind of find that talent, which does exist, but often either does not see those offers, or they might kind of self-select and think, oh, that's not for me, I'm not quite white for the role. So I think there's a big effort that needs to be made from kind of companies and also governments to just ensure that you have that diversity and that people feel kind of confident enough to put themselves forward, because it has for a very long time, I think, been a very kind of white and male field. But and again, no obligation whatsoever, but I would love to hear from any of you if you'd care to talk about the project you're working on, or I don't know at what stage of that, perhaps it's too early for that. No, then I'm equally happy, Hannah, to give you guys back your time. I know you were supposed to wrap up around 6:15 anyway, so perhaps there's a speaker after me, but happy to answer any other questions. And if there aren't any, it's been a pleasure speaking to you guys.
Thank you so much for talking to us. I just had one last question. Could you give the participants any advice on how to integrate the ethics side into their project, like how to be aware of it and how to make sure that they're not developing something that ends up biased, or how to mitigate that as much as possible?
That's a really good question. The first thing I would say is to read as much as you can and inform yourself. So I've been covering tech for 2 years now. Before that, I didn't at all. I covered climate, so which had nothing to do with it. And I'm obviously not working in AI, or I'm not a kind of inventor like you guys, but I just had to spend months and months of just reading, absorbing what the kind of main issues were. In terms of actual design, and I think you could say this is true of, again, beyond tech, urban design, but I think even if aid projects, right, that purport to kind of serve communities abroad, what I think very often happens is that the design is kind of thought through by someone without engaging or interacting with the person it's supposed to benefit. So if you have an idea, I don't know, say if you are developing a new healthcare product that's supposed to better monitor, I don't know, a certain type of person's like glucose levels or something like that, I think going to that person, or going to, a kind of focus group and asking them, what are you lacking right now? Like, what is the information that you're actually looking for? And what could we do to help? I think that may sound obvious, but it just goes such a long way. And again, we've seen this with aid programs where you have countries designing these hugely expensive programs and kind of, this white savior complex of saying, we're going to solve all your problems. But then actually, when you go on the ground, I remember doing this when reporting in Burkina Faso in West Africa kind of years ago, where I followed this project that was, had very well-intentioned aims, which was to hand out goats to communities to help boost their food security. And I remember we were doing this kind of documentary on them, and I asked the woman, I was like, how has the project been for you? Has it helped you? Expecting her to say, well, yes, I'm so grateful, it's been brilliant. And she was like, it's crap. They give me a goat every month. The goat dies. Like, it's not what I need. I need money to send my daughter to school. I need water. I need this, this, and that. And that in my mind was such a perfect example of where you had this huge kind of waste of resources that meant to do well, but having not interacted with the community that was supposed to benefit, ended up kind of missing the mark. So I think as designers, as inventors, speaking to the people who you're trying to serve, to benefit in the earliest stage possible, I think will be hugely helpful.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, guys. And yeah, wishing you the best of luck with your inventions. I'd love to hear about them at some point. And yeah, hope you've all found this useful. Thank you.